Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I am Patrice Flowers, the director of the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And tonight we are having a book talk, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons and International Security, with Dr. Fiona S. Cunningham. I am actually just going to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. Shuxian Luo, who is assistant professor here at the University of Hawaii in the Department of Asian Studies. And Shuxian Luo is um, has expertise in maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, Chinese foreign policy, and U.S.-China relations. And so hopefully we will have a wonderful discussion here tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Shushan.
Thank you, Petrus, for the very kind introduction, and welcome everyone to the virtual book talk with Dr. Fiona Cunningham. It's a privilege of mine to moderate today's discussion. We're very thrilled to host Dr. Cunningham from the University of Pennsylvania to discuss her really brilliant, insightful new book, Under Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons in International Security, which was just published last year by the Princeton University Press. Let me introduce very quickly for both of our guests for today's event. First, Dr. Cunningham is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests lie at the intersection of technology and conflict, with empirical focus on China. And her research has appeared in both academic and policy-oriented outlets, including International Security, Security Studies, and Washington Quarterly. And Fiona received her PhD in political science from MIT in 2018, and previously she was an assistant professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. And our discussant today is Dr. Elsa Kania. Elsa is currently an adjunct senior fellow with the Center for a New American a Center for New American Securities Technology and National Security Program. And she's also been a visiting scholar with the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Her research focused on China's military strategy, command capabilities, defense innovation, and emerging technological development. And Dr. Kania received her MA and PhD in political science from Harvard University's Department of Government. Fiona and Elsa, thank you so much for being here. And first, Fiona, let's start with you, maybe telling us a bit more about the main argument and findings of your book for about 20 up to 25 minutes. And after that, I'll hand it over to Elsa for a 15-minute-ish discussion, and that shall leave us plenty of time for Q&A with the audience. Over to you, Fiona.
Wonderful. Let me just share some slides. Okay. So I want to just begin by really warmly thanking Dr. Law and the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs, Dr. Flowers, for hosting me, as well as to Dr. Kania for commenting on my book. It's a real honor to join these respected scholars for this event tonight. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to share with you tonight some highlights from my book, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons and International Security, which was published by Princeton University Press last year. And this book is about what makes China's post-Cold War approach to strategic deterrence distinctive and different from other powers, and how we can use that difference to better understand broader issues such as how militaries are responding to technological change, as well as some of the key factors that are driving Chinese foreign policy choices. So I'll take about 25 minutes or so to give you a sense of what the book is about, and hopefully persuade you that you should pick it up and have a closer read. So I'll begin with the three big ideas in the book: the limited war dilemma, which is the problem at the core of the book and tees up its research question; strategic substitution, which is one of the ways of coping with that problem; and information age weapons, which are a means of implementing strategic substitution. So this is kind of these three ideas, the why, what, and how of the book. I'll then introduce my theory of strategic substitution, tell you a little bit about the research design and the sources that I use to write the empirical chapters, give you a sense of China's decision-making in those chapters on nuclear strategy, as well as precision conventional missiles, offensive cyber operations, and counterspace capabilities. And I'll wrap up with an evaluation of how China's foreign policy choices have fared over the last 25 years or so, and the book's contributions and some policy implications. So this book is about how nuclear armed states cope with a really key dilemma that's been created by the nuclear age, which is how can they still use their military capabilities to coerce their nuclear armed adversaries without triggering a catastrophic nuclear war? And specifically in the case of China, how can they gain coercive leverage if they haven't done what other nuclear armed countries have done to cope with this dilemma? Most states have either relied on conventional military capabilities that can achieve a decisive victory, think the US in the post-Cold War era, or threats of nuclear first use, think Russia in the center of the slide with its Sarmat super heavy ICBM. But China didn't take either approach, which generated a lot of suspicion that maybe China had a secret first use nuclear policy. But I argue in the book that instead China took a third approach, which I call strategic substitution. So what is strategic substitution? At its essence, it involves threatening to use non-nuclear weapons that can have strategic effects, which means that they can shape directly the decisions made by an adversary's decision makers and leaders. And those threats are then paired with a nuclear posture that threatens nuclear retaliation only in the event that a country first suffers a nuclear attack. And so what this combination of the nuclear and the non-nuclear capabilities do is to enable a country to increase the risk of escalation, including up to the nuclear level, without actually having to threaten to use their nuclear weapons. In fact, strategic substitution actually dares an adversary to be the one that will cross the threshold of using nuclear weapons first. And this approach then promises to serve as a substitute for two more traditional kind of theories of victory or options that I just mentioned, of either threatening nuclear first use or threatening a decisive conventional military victory. But before I go on and explain more about strategic substitution, I do want to highlight a couple of things that it isn't. It does not mean that a country only uses these non-nuclear weapons that it plans to use for substitution for coercion. It can also aim to use those non-nuclear weapons for warfighting, provided that it prioritizes the coercive applications of the weapons if there is any conflict between those functions. And here I'm using coercion to mean using threats to induce changes in an adversary's behavior, and warfighting to mean to impose one's will on an adversary's using military force. Strategic substitution also doesn't preclude a country from building up nuclear or conventional military capabilities that would enable it to select one of these more traditional options in the future. The third key idea in the book is that information age weapons can be used to implement strategic substitution because they can provide states with coercive leverage. Information age weapons here is my relatively narrow shorthand for precision conventional missiles that will rely on information networks for guidance, counterspace and offensive cyber operations that disrupt an adversary's use of its satellites or its computer networks. And what all answers to the limited war dilemma need to do, stepping back, is to give a state bargaining leverage. The ability to threaten to impose costs on an adversary's decision makers to influence their choices in peacetime, crises, and conflicts. And information age weapons look promising for this role. Some information age attacks share three features that enable them to threaten escalation and have strategic effects. First, they have large-scale damaging effects on an adversary's military, its society, or its allies, and they can't easily be defended against. Second, they cross salient thresholds in limited wars, which we can think of as wars in which the belligerents try to tacitly limit the intensity, the parties, and the geographical scope. Their use can also increase the risk of a nuclear war because each of these weapons can be used to deliver nuclear weapons or to attack an adversary's nuclear arsenal and its supporting infrastructure, especially in the case of cyber operations and counterspace attacks. So bringing together these three features of some of these information age weapons enable countries to use them to threaten to escalate a conflict, including up to the nuclear level, without actually having to threaten to use their nuclear weapons. But these information age weapons do need to be deliberately organized to create these escalation pressures and risks, using a bundle of capabilities, doctrine, organization and command and control arrangements, as well as being transparent about a lot of these elements to their adversaries. And I argue that states can either dial up those risks using what I call a brinkmanship posture that envisages escalation being a kind of uncontrolled slide down a slippery slope, or they can dial down those escalation risks and manage them by adopting a calibrated escalation force posture that envisages the process of escalation being more like slowly ascending the rungs of a ladder. So, like both the nuclear and conventional options for managing the limited war dilemma, strategic substitution has pros and cons. This is not a silver bullet. So why would China prefer this particular option over the others? And in the book, I develop a theory of strategic substitution to try and explain why. The basic components of the theory are that you have a leverage deficit, which is the independent variable, that initiates a search for coercive leverage, that kind of mechanism in the middle, resulting in the pursuit of an information age weapon for coercive leverage, which is the dependent variable. So let's unpack that a little bit. Leverage deficits emerge when a country's threat environment changes, for example, because it faces a crisis with an adversary. And that can reveal a problem, that their existing military capabilities are going to be inadequate for either the kind of adversary or the kind of war that they're most likely to face. And if they simply ignore that leverage deficit, that means any disputes in the future will require them either to make humiliating diplomatic concessions or fight a war that they're going to lose. So most countries tend to work hard to address these leverage deficits. But when searching for additional leverage to redress these deficits, different priorities led China down a different pathway from its nuclear peers. So what were those priorities for China? So some states are particularly sensitive to the disadvantages of the conventional or the nuclear options. China was actually sensitive to the disadvantages of both. It was conventionally inferior to the United States, and it doubted the credibility of threatening nuclear use, certainly 25 to 30 years ago when it first found itself in this situation of facing the limited war dilemma. So given these sensitivities, information age weapons became appealing substitutes because their advantages are actually the exact opposite of these conventional and nuclear options. You can acquire information age weapons for coercive leverage much faster than correcting an unfavorable conventional military balance, and threatening to use them is going to be more credible than threatening nuclear weapons use because their effects are simply less destructive. After a state then decides to pursue these information age weapons as part of strategic substitution, so achieving that top node of the dependent variable up there on the slide, it needs to select a coercive force posture to successfully complete its search for leverage. So I test the theory of strategic substitution using comparative case studies of all the substitutes that China pursued since it began to face the limited war dilemma in 1995. And I do both process tracing and congruence testing for each case. I'll use this table, which appears in the book, to explain how I tested my claims and ruled out some of the best alternative explanations. So if we start in that third column in the center where it says reason for leverage deficit, the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995 is a really important starting point for the argument because it confirmed to China's leaders they needed to prepare to fight a limited war on their periphery against the country with the most advanced conventional and nuclear capabilities on the planet. Yes, that's the United States, in which it was likely to intervene. So before that point, there was a little bit of ambiguity as to whether the US might come to Taiwan's assistance if a cross-strait war occurred. After that crisis, there was little doubt for PLA planners. And that crisis not only confronted China with a limited war dilemma, but also with a severe leverage deficit. China then faced a second leverage deficit going down in that column, one cell, when the United States accidentally bombed its embassy in Belgrade. And China's leaders to this day don't believe that that was an accident. And it revealed even more extensive shortcomings in its capabilities should a future war occur across the Taiwan Straits. In each chapter, I then trace the decision-making process in the aftermath of these two crises that connect China's search for coercive leverage to these information age weapons. But my analysis in each chapter actually begins quite a bit before the year of pursuit that's listed up there in the second column of the table. I look further back for two reasons. One is that I want to demonstrate China's leaders didn't face leverage deficits before that year of pursuit listed on the slide, which otherwise would have led them to an earlier decision to pursue that information age weapon, according to my own theory. But I also wanted to show that China often had the technological foundation to pursue these information age weapons before they faced leverage deficits. And that demonstrates that these decisions were not simply driven by the fact that China acquired the appropriate technology. Moving on to the fourth column there, which is the posture column, I also look at how China actually planned to use these capabilities, those information age weapons postures I mentioned on the previous slide, because an important part of the argument requires me to show China primarily pursued these information age weapons for coercion, even if it also planned to use them for warfighting. If China only planned to use them for warfighting, it would have been pursuing the conventional victory answer to the limited war dilemma, not strategic substitution. And finally, if you can see it behind the string of images of us, in that last right-hand column, I paired each information age weapon together with a shadow case, which was essentially a military capability that had similar effects and could have plausibly been pursued for coercive leverage. Bombers, electronic warfare, special operations forces. And what these shadow cases do is provide a point of comparison for what it looks like when China pursues a capability for warfighting and not for coercion. And they also end up then highlighting some of the key factors in China's choice of which capabilities it should actually pursue as substitutes. Things like China's strict civilian control over the military comes out from that comparison. So this book draws on what I think is a truly unique set of sources which offer very granular insights into decision-making in Beijing. And I acquired many of these sources during fieldwork in China before the pandemic, although I do continue to do research in China on some of these issues. So I analyzed hundreds of Chinese language sources, like the chronologies of military and political leaders' lives. That of former vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, Liu Huaqing, is up there on the slide. Research publications, the PLA in the middle of the slide, and now on the right-hand side, biographies of decision makers like nuclear scientist and defense industry leader Zhu Guangyao. I also conducted interviews with more than 50 Chinese experts in China that informed my theoretical claims about information age weapons and also added context to my empirical analysis. So I'll now give you a little bit of a taste of what I found in these sources. So the first empirical chapter of the book establishes two constraints on China's search for leverage: that it was conventionally inferior to the United States, and its leaders judged that nuclear threats wouldn't be credible to an adversary. It also examines 3 instances in which China debated changes to its nuclear policy, twice after it experienced leverage deficits in 1995-96 and 1999. So the first debate took place before those 2 years as the Cold War was ending. China's strategists were grappling with how are they going to define the role of nuclear weapons in new local wars that they were going to need to fight. And actually, Harvard professor Alistair Ian Johnson documented some of this advocacy within the PLA of what they called a limited nuclear deterrence posture that would have, at the very least, grown the size of China's nuclear arsenal and added tactical nuclear weapons. And that article was published in the mid-1990s. But more recent sources that I was able to examine reveal that China's top leaders also considered some other options. They considered whether actually the US-Soviet nuclear arms reductions meant nuclear weapons would become completely obsolete. But ultimately, advocates for continuity in China's nuclear strategy in that debate won the day. And they managed to do the same thing in the third debate about China's nuclear strategy, which occurred in the early 2000s after the Belgrade embassy bombing. Second artillery officers, so from China's nuclear missile force, recommended that China actually add conditions to its no first use policy, including those in conventional conflicts that were going badly, or even develop a first use campaign that could involve a nuclear strike on US space systems. But rather than accepting those suggestions, as the quote up on the slide from Jiang Zemin, the top leader at the time, articulated this logic that underpins strategic substitution of really investing instead in a diversified set of capabilities for strategic deterrence. And leadership level sources at that time were silent about changes to China's nuclear strategy, but then the debate ended by 2006 without any observable changes to China's nuclear strategy. Turning to China's first information age weapon, that was its precision conventional missile force, and China pursued that in the midst of the Taiwan Strait crisis in December of 1995. And it was looking for a missile force that could hold at risk targets in Taiwan, as well as US forces in the region with conventional rather than nuclear payloads. So when the US issued a visa to Taiwan's President Lee Teng-hui in 1995, China responded with missile tests in the Taiwan Strait. And PLA leaders evaluating those exercises after the fact felt that those missile tests were actually very effective in deterring further moves towards independence by Taiwan to the Taiwanese people. And so they decided to build up a large, long-range and accurate coercive missile force. But the reason why China had these conventional missiles in the first place to kind of experiment with is actually a more complicated tale in which organizational factors play an important role. The US had pressured China to cancel some short-range conventional missile exports to the Middle East in the late 1980s. And the Second Artillery, which was then a nuclear-only missile force, seized on this opportunity to give itself a role in a limited war across the Taiwan Straits that would likely not go nuclear. This quote up on the slide from Missile Base Commander Ge Dongsheng illustrates that these missiles were a kind of pathway for this military organization to avoid deep humiliation and galling shame that would otherwise come because nuclear weapons would play no role in a war of reunification with Taiwan. China pursued offensive cyber capabilities to gain coercive leverage after the US accidentally bombed its embassy in Belgrade in 1999. And a common PLA judgment around that time was that nuclear deterrence wasn't credible, it wasn't useful, but information deterrence involving cyber attacks would be much more effective and would generate a lot more coercive leverage, especially when they were targeting a more advanced and digitally dependent adversary. And on top of it all, they would be cheap, they would be quick, and they would paralyze adversary critical infrastructure networks. Initially, China's force posture for its cyber operations was disorganized and lacked oversight, which resulted in a brinkmanship posture that probably could have caused uncontrollable escalation if the PLA had used offensive cyber operations. And it's actually the only information age weapon for which China adopted these kinds of delegated command and control arrangements, at least in practice. Don't be fooled by the image of the slide of top leader Hu Jintao looking over a cyber operator's shoulder in a picture that subsequently appeared in the PLA museum in around 2017. Delegated command and control arrangements became a problem for China's cyber operations because its leaders wanted to ensure that China only received blowback for cyber attacks that its leaders had authorized. China itself was becoming more digitally dependent, and the cost of cyber retaliation by an adversary was increasing. So China's leaders addressed this challenge by changing its cyber force posture to one of calibrated escalation between 2012 and 2014, and they aimed to much more carefully manage escalation. So by 2015, China officially recognized the PLA had cyber units where previously it refused to do so, and consolidated them into a new organization called the Strategic Support Force, where they were subject to much tighter command and control. We can talk more about the changes to the Strategic Support Force, which is no longer in Q&A if folks are interested. So I opened the book with China's dramatic test of an anti-satellite weapon in 2007, which followed a decision a couple of years beforehand to invest in counterspace weapons that could attack US satellites for coercive leverage in a future conventional conflict. Jiang Zemin's quote up on this slide is as close as I could get to finding official leadership level acknowledgement of that decision. Unfortunately, sometimes you don't always get leaders saying exactly what you would expect when you study China's security policy. But if we look at the time, PRC sources about counterspace capabilities laid out this really explicit substitution logic. So they claimed that space deterrence was much more credible than nuclear deterrence. It was flexible, it focused on military targets in space, and it wouldn't directly cause loss of life. And unlike China's other information age weapons, the PLA always envisaged using counterspace capabilities in a calibrated escalation manner. And in fact, they did so even before they had the capabilities and the organizational structures in place to really manage escalation as that posture envisaged, which they didn't achieve until about 2015. But US moves to blunt China's counterspace capabilities have really complicated this aspect of strategic substitution. The image up on the slide comes from an article outlining some of China's concerns about the behavior of a certain set of US satellites known as the GSAP satellites. And what they do is approach other countries' satellites to characterize them. But in the views of some PLA authors, what they're actually doing is harassing Chinese satellites. And it's one of a couple of recent US space capabilities developments that really worries China. So China has been implementing strategic substitution for more than a quarter century now, and China's leaders might think that this was a success, a stopgap, or a failure. Until a stopgap in the sense that it could kind of fill the gap until China's conventional modernization is completed, a failure in the sense that it could prompt China's leaders to look more to reconsider the nuclear first use option. My evaluation of this question is that strategic substitution has been a successful stopgap, but it also has an uncertain future. I don't see China definitively reaching for the nuclear first use option just yet, and I expect that despite the progress in its conventional capabilities, it probably is still going to want some sort of capabilities to escalate a conventional conflict with the US if it ends up in a stalemate. So I'll point just as I start to close to some of the constraints on strategic substitution, and three in particular. First is US responses. US responses have been designed to blunt China's coercive leverage, such as the US withdrawal from the INF Treaty, citing China's conventional missile buildup. Second issue is growing entanglement among China's information age weapons and nuclear forces. And this makes it harder for China to manage escalation risks, most clearly in the space case. China has been building out satellite early warning system for its nuclear forces that it didn't envisage in the early 2000s when its leaders decided that a coercive counter-space force posture would be in its interests. The third and final issue concerns the effectiveness of these information age weapons. The jury is still out as to whether China's investment in offensive cyber operations has actually delivered on its promise of coercive leverage. US decision makers have moved away from this way of thinking of cyber operations, and PLA experts are actually starting to question some of these applications, watching Russia's failure to achieve decisive effects using cyber operations in the Ukraine war. But China's Volt Typhoon intrusions into US and allied critical infrastructure, pre-positioning malware that could be executed in a crisis, suggests the PLA hasn't given up just yet on this option. So wrapping up with some contributions and implications, a couple of things that this book does. The first is that it demonstrates how militaries can use emerging technology to plug gaps in their existing capabilities. And because militaries have different strengths and weaknesses, they'll often use the same technologies in different ways because of those gaps. Second, it updates the literature on coercion among nuclear armed powers, which focuses mainly on nuclear brinkmanship to account for both changes in nuclear technology, changes in technology, as well as the expansion of the nuclear club to include some countries with no first use policies. In doing so, it identifies this third way to address the limited war dilemma alongside nuclear compellence and decisive conventional victories. Turning to some implications now, US allies might adopt this strategic substitution idea under the US nuclear umbrella to get some independent coercive leverage without pursuing their own nuclear weapons. And we can see some investments in conventional missiles in this regard. And another implication is that I think it suggests any US-China nuclear risk reduction framework is going to need to include information age weapons. That comes with challenges, with new actors, and more elaborate agendas for any risk reduction, but it also provides a backdoor potentially into nuclear risk reduction through information age weapons confidence building measures, which is an area China has been reluctant to really embrace. So I'll pause there. Here is a discount code if you're interested in purchasing the book. But thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Fascinating. I wish I had this discount code when I purchased the book last year. Actually, now let's turn to Elsa for discussion. I know Elsa wrote a very impressive, insightful, thought-provoking review for Fiona's book. Without further ado, let's turn the floor to Elsa. At the same time, I would strongly encourage our audience to submit their questions through in the chat box.
All right. Well, good evening, all. I just wanted to say first, really happy and honored to be joining the conversation and commenting on the work of a scholar who's among those I admire most in this space. And I'm sure after the book talk, you can see why. Dr. Cunningham's contributions are uniquely insightful. And I think the research she did was really unique, especially in the current environment where that kind of field work, access to primary sources, and interviews is becoming increasingly challenged. And thank you so much, Dr. Law, for the invitation to join. Excited to see your future projects coming out in the next year or so as well. And very happy to be joining the conversation and looking forward to the questions and discussion as well. But yes, I would say to start, I recommend this book to nearly everyone I work with or talk to about China, especially strategic capabilities and deterrence. And I think that some of the history and the primary sources that Dr. Cunningham brings to bear are just really so relevant, especially at a moment where we are seeing the continued consequences of those catalytic moments and turning points in US-China relations playing out. Whether it is the legacy of the capabilities that were developed after the Belgrade embassy bombing through what Chinese leaders called the 995 program, named after that month in 1999, where that accidental attack occurred. And I've also had conversations with Chinese military officers who continue to assert that there is no way it possibly could have been accidental. And I think that speaks to these misperceptions and how these moments in history have really shaped the trajectory of US-China relations and competition with truly enduring impacts. So the history and case studies are really, really rich, and I think very much worth reading. I think what is really challenging about this topic as well is that this is also incredibly dynamic at a moment where we see continued evolution in China's military strategic guidelines and capabilities development and some of the technologies that PLA leaders believe are catalyzing a new revolution in military affairs. So I think a lot of my comments will focus on sort of how do we characterize where the PLA may be going from here, and looking at building upon this history and this theory and this approach of strategic substitution. To what extent are we seeing something of a progression towards more of an all of the above or an overmatch approach, as there is, I think, especially since 2022, this perception among Chinese party and military leaders about intensification of strategic competition, a more challenging environment. So might posit perhaps building upon some of the theory that we're seeing another inflection point within the past couple of years that things beyond some of the scope of the research, but it could make perhaps for fascinating conversation as we think about to what extent has the continued buildup of China's nuclear arsenal and capabilities, as has come out in the media recently, the dramatic expansion of the cyberspace force since that was stood up independently of the strategic support force in April 2024, and the experimentation with new types of coercion. How much do we speak to the fact that there is still this search for leverage that is animating China's strategic calculus and investment. So I think that some of these recent developments both validate and challenge the theory depending on your perspective, and just sort of speak to all of these new dynamics and dimensions that are coming into play and how China approaches coercion and deterrence. And I guess I'd point to, in particular, informed by some of my recent research or issues of interest, how we've seen that the information dimension of these capabilities with continued evolution of China's approach to cyberspace operations, including concepts of cognitive domain operations and the integration of PLA psychological warfare forces with a cyberspace force based on open source analysis. There's, I think, increasingly this emphasis not just on capabilities, but on the cognitive effects and ways in which space or cyberspace capabilities can be uniquely coercive if their impacts can be amplified against the backdrop of other psychological operations conducted on social media. So I think that is one of those trends that reflects this continued evolution and experimentation that has characterized China's approach and this embrace of new technologies and capabilities that I think is really at the core of the argument in the book, whether we call this a degree of technological determinism or technology driving tactics and strategy. I think that embrace of new forces and capabilities is really a unique element of how Chinese Communist Party and People's Liberation Army leaders have seen the future of warfare and options for coercion in this context as well. I think one question that perhaps merits more extensive discussion than we have time for this evening is the implications of this theory and of these developments for China's approach to Taiwan. And this is arguably an era, a dimension where we've seen coercion both achieving some effects, but also often backfiring, and also a continued experimentation with integration of not just these information age, but more conventional or traditional capabilities, the large-scale pressure operations that have become a recurrent feature for those who followed the news around the holidays with exercises like Justice Mission or Joint Sword and Straight Thunder in the past. And I think that's an interesting illustration of continued evolution of this approach to coercion and the search to get new sources of leverage to deter both the possibility of American intervention, which first so keenly came into play with that initial 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, as the book discusses, and then looking at bringing into play as Chinese military conventional and joint operational capabilities become ever more considerable, ways in which that has become a quite salient feature of some of these recent years of attempts at coercion and deterrence, especially since Speaker of the House Pelosi's visit in 2022, which is something that I know the book also points to as one of these potential moments of catalytic impacts or that provoke new directions in the search for leverage. So I think it's definitely a really dynamic and fascinating moment for all of us who try to track these trends in PLA strategy, doctrine, force design, emerging capability development. The China Military Power Report, for instance, highlights some of these new sort of emerging concepts that have come into play in the context of Chinese military objectives for 2027 around the notion of pursuing a decisive victory, of strategic counterbalance, of strategic deterrence and control. And I think what is both concerning and I think merits additional consideration is the possibility that relative to the concerns about control of escalation that previously characterized aspects of PLA choices of force posture, there now is more of an openness to escalation or pursuit of overmatch, or sort of more of a maximalist approach to overall force posture based on some of these recent trends and developments. So what the implications will be for cross-strait security and deterrence, for US-China military interaction and competition, I think we're continuing to see play out quite dynamically, both diplomatically and in some of the dialogues and discussions on where there may be options for risk mitigation. But think definitely that some of these recent trends highlight the importance of understanding this history and how China got to where it is today, and some of these drivers and interactivities that have really been sort of core features influencing this force posture and this very creative asymmetric approach that we continue to see play out in with new technologies and capabilities as those come to the forefront of PLA thinking today. So I want to make sure I leave enough time for questions and conversation, so I will stop there for now, but just want to close by saying again, this book is truly phenomenal. For those in the audience who have not read it, please use that discount, go out and buy it, read it, share it with your classmates and colleagues, because I think we need more deeply sourced, highly rigorous, informed research on Chinese military power right now, and Dr. Cunningham's definitely at the forefront of this debate. So very, very happy and honored to be joining the conversation, and excited to see more of your work going forward, Fiona.
Excellent, Fiona. I would like to respond to Elsa's remarks before we get to the audience question.
With pleasure. Dr. Law, roughly how long should I take? Just so I want to make sure I leave some time for Q&A.
Well, maybe 5 minutes or so that we can still have
Okay.
about 10 minutes for Q&A.
Great. Okay. Well, I just want to begin by saying a huge thank you to Dr. Kania, to Elsa, and also to commend both Dr. Law and Dr. Kania for their own research on various issues to do with Chinese military strategy, technology, and Chinese foreign policy. You should definitely watch this space for what they're working on as well. I just want to pick up on maybe a handful of things from Dr. Kania's, I think, really insightful observations about and sort of probing questions about where to next, because I think that is, she pointed out one of the challenges of doing this kind of a project, which is that it's a moving target even while you're writing it. And even once it's published, things move quickly, right? So you're sort of trying to write with an eye to the future of how can this framework continue to be useful going forward, and what sort of factors should we keep an eye on. So I'll touch on maybe 4 things here. The first one is, I think, just this idea that there was a new inflection point at some time in the early 2020s, whether it is the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan, or there's some kind of slower moving intensification of strategic competition between the United States and China that is altering the way that China is thinking about the limited war dilemma, the way it's altering the way that it thinks about approaching strategic deterrence and the capabilities that it needs going forward. I think that is absolutely accurate. It leads to this, I think, set of issues of crises versus these slower moving sort of trends, and at what point leaders in China got to the point where they realized, look, this strategic competition piece is here to stay, and this is the reality that we're moving forward. And whether that sort of more gradual progression as opposed to a crisis is going to lead to slightly different ways of responding in terms of one's military capabilities. I think the point where it does intersect really nicely with the leverage deficits that I talk about in the book is that this is really about political factors. It's not that the US military, I mean, obviously the US military has been doing a lot of very impressive and energetic things and moving towards the Indo-Pacific in the same period of time. But it's the politics that's really driving China's choices. It's not like, the US is, increased its force posture movements into the Indo-Pacific region, although of course they're reacting to those kinds of pieces as well. But where attention goes on these issues of the limited war dilemma and strategic deterrence comes, to my mind, very much from these political factors rather than capability factors. So that's one point where I think there are some ways to think about urgency versus more gradual changes, but the politics is really what's driving, in my opinion, Chinese behavior. The second is on the expansion of China's nuclear arsenal, which occurred while I was midway through writing this book, and it's obviously an issue that I have been following for some time in my research. And I'll comment on this just by saying that I do have some work in progress based on some more recent field work within China, suggesting that it's not the pursuit of coercive leverage and it's not the pursuit of first use that is driving these changes. Part of China's community sees this as a way of building up a more robust retaliatory capability to counter some of the changes in US nuclear strategy, as well as the intensification of strategic competition. But then there are also actors within China who I would argue have a new perspective on what nuclear weapons can do for China's interests that is more of a more is better and more buys you a sort of political or a psychological effect that is not necessarily connected to nuclear posture or nuclear exchange rates, the kind of mechanisms that a lot of the nuclear literature and most arms control specialists in China too would think about the impact of nuclear weapons on a conflict. So the nuclear piece I see less as moving towards nuclear first use and more as a acting through slightly different logics to shape US behavior. Fourth point I'll just note is the implications of some of the developments for Taiwan. I do think that a new strand of, I will just say, like Chinese thinking in terms of foreign and defense policy is not necessarily just how you coerce Taiwan by keeping the United States out of a conflict, but also how you coerce Taiwan in a more direct sense. And a lot of that experimentation, I think, is coming a little bit more in the gray zone. And so it's a different sort of set of problems in some ways, because it is not coercion under the nuclear shadow where you're dealing with this constraint. But often there's a similar constraint, which is not wanting to end up in an armed conflict and not wanting to give other countries an option to intervene. So seeing some of those pieces and some of the same tools are being used in terms of missiles or cyber operations, but then a whole other set of tools that are administrative and in some cases non-military. And then the final piece, just on the sort of maximalist approach, and that sort of, China's going, all of the answers to the limited war dilemma rather than just one of them. I guess what I see is that to use your conventional capabilities for coercive leverage, you do need to have a very decisive conventional advantage so everyone knows who would win the war if it were to break out. And so I think China will still want to have some options to escalate out of a deadlocked or attrition sort of conventional conflict, which will continue to have a pretty important role for something other than just its conventional capabilities, whether it be nuclear or the substitution capabilities to sort of bring about that political outcome that China is seeking. And even in a country like the United States, which we could argue has the full suite of these capabilities, you do start to see preferences for using a certain set of tools, which arguably I think would be the conventional option in the US case. So even countries who can have it all still have their favorites. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the rest of the discussion. But thank you so much, Dr. Kania, for those really thoughtful and insightful comments.
Excellent. Seems we're having a bit shy audience here in Hawaii. But before I will getting any questions from the audience, maybe I'll just use my privileged place as the moderator to ask my own questions while I read Fiona's excellent book. Since it mentioned that it's really political factors that hasn't been at play in driving China's selection of military strategy, I think I'd like to hear you elaborate a bit more on that point, because given all these recent political turmoils ongoing, within PLA, because it's really a key challenging for all of us studying Chinese security policy, to try to look into this black box of Chinese decision making and internal politics including those involving PLA. I think your research highlights, the critical roles of the rocket force, and also the specialized units handling cyber and space domains. And given the recent, high-profile purges we have seen with the PLA, including the rocket force, and also the restructure of the dismantlement of the strategic support force, how resilient do you think, China's doctrine for using the information age weapons? Do these internal political turmoils alter or threaten Beijing's ability or thinking to execute the escalation control that you described in this book. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you for the question, and please do, for the audience, ask some questions. Don't be shy. I think that there's two sort of sets of political factors that you can think of as having an influence on these strategic substitution pieces. One is the external political factors, which is specifically, I think, the relationship with the United States that ends up creating the pressures and also just the motivation in the first place to need an answer to the limited war dilemma, to need a sort of strategic deterrence posture. And I see that as being a little bit different from the internal political pressures, but they do creep into the narrative, even though I did not set out to sort of write about Chinese civil military relations or party-army relations more properly. And the way that they tend to show up in the book is in which kinds of information age weapons, which kinds of substitutes China tends to prefer. And they are ones where the top leadership, so the civilian chairman of the Central Military Commission, Xi Jinping now, previously Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, but then also the uniformed Central Military Commission leaders, so that they can actually like control the use of these capabilities within China's territory. And that, I mean, technology is also a factor for why China doesn't necessarily want to invest in conventional bombers, but you could think also of special operations forces as being something that could knock out strategic communications in a similar way to counterspace capabilities. But then you have to trust a group to go abroad and not necessarily be in touch with you and do exactly what it is that you want them to do, right? And that's a tricky thing, I think, in the nature of China's party-army relations. I think that where the current changes in the top levels of Chinese leadership, the purges in particular of Zhang Youxia, the resilience there, I think, just lies from or the lack of resilience in some ways, if you like, is that all of these capabilities are described in various Chinese texts as requiring the authorities of the National Command Authority or the Supreme Command to be able to use them in their most strategic variants. And at the moment, there's only two people that sit on that body, Xi Jinping and an individual who does not have a tremendous amount of operational experience. So, of course, these two individuals could run the decision-making for using these capabilities, but if you're in the midst of a conflict and you are trying to run a country at the same time as I imagine Xi Jinping would, it's too much. I would argue it's even too much of a set of decisions for the Central Military Commission to make without some other types of decision-making support or structures that enable them to ensure the sum of these information age weapons capabilities used coercively is greater than the parts. So, where those innovations might happen, I think may tell you whether or not this kind of system or this way of operating would be or would not be resilient to these kinds of changes. But I think at the moment, I would wait until some of those empty seats are filled before feeling confident that China would be using these capabilities exactly as planned.
Great. Now let's turn to one question from our audience, Jill. Thank you for our talk today and your book. And given Hawaii's strategic location, especially in the new age technology and military nuclear threats and strategic posturing, how do you see Hawaii's location as a key in the Indo-Pacific strategy, especially with Maui's Vanguard Center and the plans to add 7 telesubs in Haleakala?
So I can take a shot at this question. I think that within the PRC thinking, there's not a tremendous amount of differentiation between Hawaii and the continental United States that I've seen. Others may have seen different sorts of pieces. But I think that Hawaii will continue to be a pretty important target for the PLA because of the location of Indo-Pacific Command there for offensive cyber operations. And I I do not recall at this point specifically whether I had seen reports of critical infrastructure intrusions into Hawaii's critical infrastructure with Volt Typhoon, those cyber attacks that I mentioned. But it would surprise me immensely if it wasn't high on the target list. The bigger issue, I think, actually comes from the range of precision conventional missiles, because at the moment, um, unless China's DF-27 capability comes on board China imminently, it does not have a conventional precision strike capability that goes beyond Guam that I believe is fully operational. So, but the capability is in the works, and I think a little bit about some of these distance pieces, obviously from a different nationality perspective, but because you see relatively similar issues with strategic depth for allies like Australia, where the United States is putting a lot of capability, and wherever you put capabilities that could flow into um, the Western Pacific and a Taiwan contingency, I think you will see China's efforts to counter that power projection follow pretty quickly. And Hawaii, I think, is pretty high on the list for those kinds of capabilities. I don't know if my fellow panelists also, or Dr. Kania or Dr. Law also want to add in on this piece in particular, since I'm speaking from Philadelphia and not from Hawaii.
I guess I would just add that I think the quotation and the concept that Dr. Cunningham highlighted in reference to cyber operations about blurring the boundaries between peace and war, and that approach carries through. A lot of Chinese cyber strategists have emphasized there's really no boundaries between the front line and the home front. And if I remember the media reporting correctly, one of the Volt Typhoon associated attacks within Hawaii was against a water utility, and a lot of the attacks, including Massachusetts, including really across the continental United States, as well as targeting Guam and Hawaii specifically, certain proportion of those did look at civilian critical infrastructure. And that is troubling. That is also unsurprising in that it's consistent with aspects of Chinese writings going back decades on cyber attacks as trying to achieve disruption, have cognitive effects on society, undercut will to fight or will to intervene or resist, respectively. And I think what is sometimes worrisome, but again predictable, is when some of these concepts or theories that Chinese writers and strategists have been talking about for decades start to be more consistent with what we are seeing in the news playing out in the real world about some of those concepts and capabilities really being brought to bear. And I think that highlights for all of us who are living here in Hawaii, or really anywhere on what we would think is a safer home front, that these threats and potential for exploitation of coercive capabilities is really a major threat that demands more attention to resilience. And recognizing quite keenly that PLA Cyberspace Force is appears to be preparing exactly for those kinds of strikes.
Great. With that cautious, but not a little bit, not too alarmist note, we're right now precisely at 6 p.m. sharp. That brings us to the end of our today's event, and I'd like to let's extend a huge thank you to Fiona for sharing such invaluable and insightful findings from her research, and to Elsa for a thought-provoking and very invaluable discussion for Fiona's book. And I highly encourage everyone to have a purchase a copy of Fiona's book, and using that discount that I didn't have the opportunity to use. And it's definitely a must read for anyone, I think, these days navigating the complexity of modern day deterrence and Chinese military strategy. And finally, I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in and contributing the excellent questions to the conversation. Now let's turn the podium back to Petrus for final words.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us this evening. I appreciate it. the timeliness of the work, and I certainly learned a lot myself. And I also want to thank Elsa for a really engaging discussion, and Shushin for really putting together these two panelists for us. So please do look out for our events at the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs. If you're interested at all in joining our mailing list, please take a look at our website, and we'll be happy to have you join us for future events. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.
Thank you, Petrus. Everyone.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.